Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's virtual public program. I'm Chloe Green. I am the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. To begin our program, I would like to introduce our Vice President of Education and Engagement, David Armenti. So David is a Baltimore native who received his BA in American History and American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. So if anybody's alumni from there, let us know in the chat. So he also holds a Master's of Arts in Teaching degree from Loyola University. So alumni from Loyola, let us know also. So prior to MCHC, he served as a research archivist for the Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery Project, documenting historical examples of resistance among enslaved African Americans in Maryland. David specializes in bringing the state's unique history to life through primary source collections and inquiry-based learning, some that are guided experiences you can have right here at the museum. And so he leads these experiences on topics such as African American history, the United States Civil War period, and the Civil Rights Movement. So I will now pass the program to David so that he may welcome our wonderful guests from AFRO Charities. So David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And if we're talking about alumni, let's not forget Baltimore Polytechnic Institute or Poly for my local folks. But let's get down to it and welcome our wonderful guest for today's program. I'm really fortunate to be able to have this conversation with Savannah Wood, who is an artist with deep roots in Baltimore and Los Angeles. She works primarily in photography, text, and installation to explore spirituality, domesticity, and how our relationships place and shape our identities. Major themes in her work include ancestral research, reframing land as a readable archive, and depicting humans as part of, rather than separate from, the natural world. Her projects reconnect people with the everyday beauty of our world and histories that lie hidden beneath the surface. As the Executive Director of AFRO Charities, Wood is creating infrastructure to increase access to the 130-year-old AFRO American Newspaper's extensive archives. In this role, she has shepherded the organization through a period of historic growth, initiated new programming, and attracted support from national funders, including the Mellon Foundation and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Incredible. Woods is a graduate cum laude of the University of Southern California. She's a 2022 Salzentz Innovation Fund Fellow, 2022 Creative Capital Finalist, and 2019 to 2021 Robert W. Deutsch Foundation Fellow. And like 4 generations of ancestors before her, she lives and works in Baltimore, Maryland, sharing and preserving Black stories. So everybody join me in welcoming Savannah Wood.
Hey, David.
Always wonderful to see you, Savannah. And I should add on to that we are both board members of the Baltimore City Historical Society. So within that role too, we've shared many a Zoom together. And I see some of our colleagues are shouting out in the chat as well, or former colleagues. So again, happy to see everybody here. So Savannah, I figured we could get started by talking a little bit more about what AFRO Charities is and how it kind of links into the incredible history of the Afro American newspaper overall. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So hi, everybody. And I want to give a couple of shout outs too. We have a board member from AFRO Charities on, Beverly Carter. Dion Moses is here. She works with us. Megan McShay is on. She's also working with us as a digitization consultant. Sorry. So hello, everybody. And thanks for having me. So for anybody who is not aware, the Afro American Newspapers is one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country that's continuously operating. And it was founded right here in Baltimore in 1892. So AFRO Charities was founded in 1963, and it really was established as a way to take on some of the philanthropic projects that the Afro American newspapers had already been doing, but to shift it under a nonprofit organization so that there was more opportunity to fundraise for those things. So Some of those programs include Afro Clean Block, which is an annual cleanup tradition that we'll probably talk about a little bit later, as well as Mrs. Santa, which is still ongoing to this day. So over the past 3 years or so, we've been expanding the mission of Afro Charities to include care for the Afro American newspaper's extensive archives. So the archives really document the entire 130-year history of the Afro American newspapers, but also 130 years of history, world history, told from a Black perspective. So what we're working on is preserving that history for future generations through physical preservation, digitization, as well as artistic and educational programming that really brings that collection to life.
And I'm excited to talk about that kind of public engagement aspect, because I think that's so important. You know, obviously, you need to preserve the items for them to be accessible and to be able to share out in the many creative ways that you have. And I've benefited in my work so much from the archives and the accessibility as it was and as it's increasing. But could we talk a little bit about your role as well and what you've been doing with the organization since 2019? I know that you have an artist background, but you also have, you know, this background within archival work and even your personal history within the institution, which I'd love to get into as well, if that's all right. But what kind of has been the process? What brought you back in 2019?
Yeah, I definitely have an artist background. I would not say I don't have any official archival training, so I have to be really upfront about that. But my my entry point into the archives has always been as an artist and from an artistic lens. So I've spent time working with other nonprofit organizations, both in Chicago and Los Angeles, that were artist-led, artist-run, but that did really significant projects with archives that helped me to understand how people who are not necessarily considered traditional scholars could see and interpret these historical records in ways that are equally meaningful as people who might come to this work with a PhD. So it really piqued my curiosity after having worked with these different arts organizations to think about the Afro's legacy and the Afro's archives and what we might be able to do with that collection as well. So the Afro newspaper was founded in 1892. And from the very beginning, my great-great-grandfather, John H. Murphy Sr., has been involved in the newspaper, but they didn't come to own the paper until 1897. But so it's been our family's newspaper since that time. So that's 125 years of the 130. So we basically just call him the founder. And the story goes that his wife gave him $200 to invest in this newspaper to purchase it. So I consider her to be a founder of the paper as well. Her name is Martha Howard Murphy. So that's the like familial background and why this collection was of interest to me. But I wouldn't have been thinking about archives at all if it hadn't been from for these artistic approaches to archival collections that I experienced at other organizations like the Rebuild Foundation in Chicago and Clock Shop in Los Angeles. And specifically at Clock Shop, we did a project looking at Octavia Butler's archive at the Huntington Library and invited artists and writers to engage with that collection and to make new work inspired by it. So that was a real eye-opener for what kinds of engagements could happen with a collection as rich as hers. And, you know, I don't think I've never seen a collection like ours before. It's not that I've seen a lot of different collections, but I've never seen a collection like the Afros before. There's 3 million photographs in the collection. There are thousands of letters and other types of documents. There's reporters' notebooks in there. There's like the actual metal plates that were used to print images in the newspaper. So there's a wealth of information there, a wealth of different materials that are in there. And I'm so curious to see how people who, you know, are not traditional scholars would bring those things to life, because we've had a lot of experience of seeing, you know, historical books come out where there's a lot of reference to the Afro archives. We've seen several documentaries come out where there's a lot of reference to the Afro archives, as well as several other archives. But since I came back in 2019, it was the first time that we've really explicitly invited artists to look at the collection and to make new work. And so that's one of the ways that we're opening up the collection for new types of interpretation, and for the public to experience it in that way.
That's so fascinating, and I definitely want to circle back on some of those examples a little bit later. But would you mind if we got into the genealogy a little bit, because I am always nerding out on genealogy and that sort of ancestral history and those personal connections to it that really illuminate the value on some level. But you mentioned John Murphy, who was, as I understand it, a formerly enslaved individual. He served in the Civil War under the United States Colored Troops. Just an incredible personal story in and of itself. And I love how you lifted up his wife and her role, which as we know in history, sometimes those contributions of women and others get muted in an unfair way. But how did that initial family really come into this business, aside from the investment that you mentioned, and how did that kind of carry down the line ancestrally to ultimately link up with you?
So my understanding is that John was in his 50s when he got into this business. So it was kind of late in life. But if you can imagine somebody, like, just imagine the arc of his life. If he was born enslaved, went into the army, served the country, came out a free man. That's already like a huge transition that's happened in a pretty short period of time in his life. And then to come out of that, you must have this sense of possibility. And we're also talking about Baltimore, which has had, the largest population of free Black people before the Civil War. That's a fact that I never knew growing up. I had to learn that much later. And I always find that to be astounding. But so you're in this milieu of all this freedom and new freedom, and thinking about, what kind of impact can I have? And so, I think it's really fascinating that he decided that a newspaper would be the best way to express ideas. And it's really in this long tradition of the Black press that, we want to plead our own cause. Far too long, others have spoken for us. And so he's carrying on that tradition in a sense. But he starts this much later in life. And I just have to imagine that there was a sense of urgency and also a real interest to see just how far he could go in his life, given his, where he began. And the story with his wife, Martha, is really fascinating to me. It's something that I didn't really learn growing up either. Within our own family lore, I heard a lot about John. As you said, a lot of times women kind of get cast to the side. But with her story, it actually was pretty well documented in the newspaper also. I just didn't know about it. And so I stumbled across a scrapbook with her whole obituary, all this like documentation about her funeral, letters that came in from all over the country. And that's where I started to learn about her backstory and the fact that she was also born enslaved in Maryland, but that her father, also born enslaved, had become a wealthy landowner before he died. And so another person in our lineage who's had this like huge transformation over his life from being born enslaved to then dying a wealthy landowner. Like, what is that story? And there's only so many documents to kind of piece it together, but that's part of what I've been working on, is trying to piece that together. But that's ultimately where Martha got her, initial investment to invest in the newspaper. So, it's just all of these like really fascinating stories. But so for them, they had 10 children and all of the boys worked in the newspaper business and some of the girls did. But then the next generation, it was Carl Murphy's children were 5 girls and all of them worked for the newspaper business. So it's, it's just been through the line. Everybody learns about the family business, has the opportunity to work there. It was really John and Martha's intention that their family would have a place that they could always come to work. So I feel really blessed 5 generations on to be able to still have that connection to that original intention and to be doing work that's like so right up my alley. You know what I mean? It's like, it's all the different things that really excite me. And it also happens to be carrying on this family legacy, which is quite an honor.
So Carl Murphy was the original girl dad, huh?
Yes.
I can relate. But there's so much meat to talk about there. But you mentioned the unique context of Baltimore, having the largest free Black population. And then, of course, after the Civil War, kind of carrying on that legacy of having that strong community that was, not willing to be muted or diminished. And the Afro being one of the major voices contributing to that fact, and the necessity of it. Something that becomes very obvious in my work as an educator and as a historian is the way that traditional, predominantly white press reflects its bias on almost any description of the Black community. And that goes for Baltimore, other parts of Maryland, and around the country. Particularly when it comes to using this material with students, and you talked about non-traditional, whether they're artists, students, or teachers, people that don't have archival training. I really see that as a major part of my role as a museum educator, to try to make those materials accessible and kind of scaffold the way to use them. But it is those gaps in perspective that really hammer this home. And there's really one example right here behind me of the Ford's Theater protests that took place in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which were covered extensively by the Afro American newspaper, but almost not covered at all by the Baltimore Sun. So it's very clear why that would be necessary. But I've also had the pleasure of incorporating this into school-based programs at the museum, professional development for educators. And it's really, you always see that light bulb moment with educators and students where even somebody like you who had family connections may not have been aware of kind of how robust and incredible these resources were. And I know how I've gotten to the resources, whether that's through ProQuest and some of our local library systems. But is there a way that you would recommend folks access these archives, or do we just use all of these different entry points like Enoch Pratt Library? Is there a recommended way?
Yeah, I think that's actually like the best way to start, because if folks aren't aware, the Enoch Pratt Library subscribes to ProQuest, and we have the Afro American Newspapers has a relationship with ProQuest to make a large swath of the actual newspapers available, searchable through a digital portal. So you don't even have to go anywhere. You can be in your house with your library card online and sign in and see nearly all of the Baltimore newspapers from 1893 through 1988, and then it picks up again at 2003 to the present, which is a remarkable resource and a really great starting point for any research. Beyond that, we do have a lot of other materials that are not yet digitized. There are, like I mentioned, there's so many photographs that aren't yet digitized. There are, notes and notebooks and letters and audio files and all these other things that exist that haven't become super publicly accessible quite yet. And for those materials, I think starting with the Pratt portal to ProQuest is the best way, because then you have a sense of what was covered, and you have a sense of like whether or not we might have more in the collection related to that. And I think I saw Dion put this in the chat, but you can always reach out to archives at afro.com, and that redirects directly to Dion. And she's an amazing resource for internal research into the physical collections. So she can, see what we have within the physical collection, pull those files, let you know what's in there, if anything's of interest, and then take you through that whole process, if it's public facing to do licensing, or if it's just for internal research to just get the files to you. So I would say, yes, ProQuest is like a great first start. And then we're working on creating more robust avenues for people to be able to see the images and to see what other materials will be are in the collection as well. There's been a lot of work that's already happened before I even got here, obviously. There's a tool called Library Host that we used some time ago, but it's a bit outdated. And so what we're doing right now is migrating all of the data that's there that does have records for our physical files to a new platform as we're digitizing the images. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. I love Dion is in the chat right now, like, please allow 2 to 3 weeks. I know, let me not say she's going to give it to you immediately, because it does take time. It's there's there's a lot to manage. So we're working on it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dion. You're really doing some of the work for us here, plugging all of those avenues to get at these resources. That's really incredible. And you spoke about the fact that, and I'm definitely want to get back to the kind of student research and also the activism piece in a little bit. But you mentioned the ongoing digitization effort, the preservation of the physical materials, and the fact that Afro Charities has been around, I don't want to say only, but since 1963, so less than half of the history of the overall institution. I know Morgan State University played a role in preservation and hosting some of the items. Could you talk a little bit about how the physical collection has developed in terms of where it's been housed, its preservation, and maybe some of the next steps with that you already alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the what we're calling the archive is essentially a newspaper morgue. That would be the correct terminology, basically. And it's a fairly common practice for newspapers to keep files on basically related to their production. So it would be a subject file about a person or a place or an event that people who are writing for the paper could refer back to it. So it's basically the internal newspaper library. Because we've amassed all of these files over 130 years, and because of the shift into digital, working on computers and things like that, the collection of physical materials has significantly slowed down. And I think there's been, I can't say for sure because I don't have all the answers to what happened around different periods of time, but I know there's been several different iterations and attempts to digitize parts of the collection, to catalog them, and some of them more successful than others. Like there was in 2007, through, I think it was with Johns Hopkins, they got a fairly large grant to catalog all of the different files that are in the collection. And I think they nearly finished it, but didn't quite finish that process. But those are the materials that are now on library hosts that we're migrating out. And then back in 1988, I think I found a letter in the archives that was, trying to computerize the collection. So, there's like all of these attempts and this understanding of like, this is very important history that we need to maintain, and how do we keep it organized? So there's been all these different successive attempts, and we're kind of just picking up the mantle where people left off and pulling it forward. So we were, everything had been housed at 2519 North Charles Street, which is one of the former locations of the Afro. And before that, it was at 628 North Utah, which was the longest location for the Afro. And at some point, the collection moved to Bowie State. And then at another point, it moved to Morgan State University. A portion of it was in their actual library building, and another portion of it, the larger portion of it, was really just in storage. And so we're super grateful to both of those universities for letting us have our collections there, have offices there, work out of those spaces. It was really kind of invaluable. Over the past 3 years, because we've been working to shift some of these responsibilities over to the nonprofit organization, because this really is a public benefit, this collection. So we should be able to support the collection with public funds. That's when we've kind of been more intensely focused on preserving this collection, making sure we have the proper housing for it, the proper boxes, acid-free folders, that we're double checking all of the inventories that we have for it, that we're working on the digitization. So right now the collection is housed at a Maryland State Archives facility temporarily. And then in the future, our plan is to move everything to the Upton Mansion, which is a historic building in West Baltimore that we're redeveloping as the physical repository for the collection, as well as a research center that people will be able to access. So instead of us having to do a bunch of back-end research and send you files digitally, researchers will actually be able to come to a physical location and pull files in a reading room there. But, all this stuff takes time. So we're mapping it out. We have a long trajectory, a long road ahead of us, and a lot more work to do. We're actively fundraising for that building. And we are actively digitizing files. We are actively updating the inventories. We're, all of this is work that's ongoing and very labor intensive. So, big visions and a long road ahead.
And anybody who's done research knows how necessary all of that detail, those finding aids, that processing, it's so tedious. But as you mentioned, when it's 130 years of collections, and it's so essential to expanding and broadening the historical record in many ways, we really want to honor all of the people that contributed to that. And I think this is as good a time as any to plug that support for, oh, there it is right in the chat. So we definitely want to lift that up and let folks know how they can support the charities. And that's a really exciting project coming up with the Upton Mansion. And
I should mention also really quickly just that, with this being an internal newspaper morgue, newspaper library, it's not organized like most other archives might be organized, like we have, it's spread, like if you're looking for files on Thurgood Marshall, for instance, it might be you might find files in 15 different boxes that on North Charles Street would have been in 5 different rooms. So once one room filled up, you move to the next room with boxes, so it's not organized traditionally. So that's one of our challenges that we're encountering as we're getting a handle on the collection and really mapping out everything that's there. And I should also mention, I know I shouted her out earlier, but Megan McShay has been an incredible help and resource on this project as somebody who is super knowledgeable about archival systems and digitization and keeping us on task with all of the details as we, think about the huge vision of what's to come.
Yeah, well, I'll be really excited to see how that develops, and especially once that kind of public space is open for researchers. That's going to be really incredible. So going back to what the kind of the purpose of the newspaper or some of the roles that it played in presenting a more accurate and uplifting view of the community that you just weren't going to get in other places. I do want to be upfront too that it's not that the Afro only covered activism, of course. Things we're covering everyday life, personal affairs, and political events, just like any other newspaper. But especially from an educational perspective, that looking at equal rights activism again really illuminated that point for me. In fact, just yesterday, I was working with a high school student group from Baltimore who were looking at the issue of redlining and housing discrimination. And again, what you're going to find in the Baltimore Sun was, very matter of fact about some of the pioneering segregation laws that we had here in our city, which is a shameful part of that history. Whereas the Afro American newspaper, again, was really humanizing the individuals involved and digging into it on more of a personal level and how it impacted people and communities. The Ford's Theater protest I mentioned earlier is a part of that as well. But I don't know if you could speak to maybe how much did activism play in the kind of priorities of the newspaper? It was becoming more prominent in the early 1900s when it seemed that kind of that Jim Crow and backlash to the Reconstruction period were still impacting communities. So did the founders and the directors kind of see that as a role, or did that just kind of happen naturally?
I think it's kind of in the DNA of the paper and in the DNA of the Black press. I mean, when you look at the first Black newspaper to come out, there's a literal manifesto for what the Black press is, and its essential role is to tell the truth about what Black people are experiencing. So I don't know that that's necessary. I mean, it's intentional, but it also is just a relaying of the facts as we see them, and as they affect us, So I think that's certainly part of it. I think when you would look at John Murphy, he said something, there was a credo that was printed in the paper that was, something about staying out of, I'm not going to get it right, so I don't want to misquote him, but I will say that his son, Carl, I would say definitely took up this role of activist more maybe not intentionally is kind of the word I want to use. Like he was more active in his activism and more directly making sure that the editorial pages were commenting on everything that was going on in the city in a very direct and confrontational way. Whereas I would say John, his father, was maybe less confrontational, but still telling the story. I think Carl Murphy maybe had a better understanding of how the press could be used to shift culture and what role, and really knew how to knew just how to use those pages to push politicians and to make change happen and to really support some of the activist organizations within the city. So I would say that second generation is probably where that really took hold and pushed harder. But yeah, it's definitely part of it.
And of course, they were working alongside other organizations that were kind of coming to prominence or building up more locally at that time, like the Baltimore chapter of the NAACP, the Urban League in later years as well. And it wasn't just the founders and the directors of the newspaper, but it was the actual, the workers, the people doing the writing, the reporting, and the photographing. A couple of those individuals that, I'm really indebted to in my work include Paul Henderson, who took the photograph behind me as well, and Clarence Mitchell Jr., just among the many that contributed to that process. And, those two individuals really came to the fore in the coverage of racial terror lynching in Maryland. And, you talked about Baltimore communities. The Afro was not limited to the Baltimore area, right? Because it was as late as the early 1930s that we were still seeing this racial terror occurring in different parts of the state, including the Lower Eastern Shore, where Paul Henderson and Clarence Mitchell Jr. traveled, in 1933 to cover the immediate aftermath of George Armwood's murder. So I'm also part of the state commission, Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation, that's looking at and covering these. And it's been essential to have the Black press because, again, that really illuminated how not just neutral white newspapers could be, but actively harmful to these situations and fanning the flames of hatred. So, that's definitely a major role that they contributed in that respect. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but I definitely wanted to lift up that part of the story too, because, it was literal life and death in some of these situations.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And right. So that's what I mean by it's in the DNA of the paper. It's like if your lived experience is to experience terror on a day-to-day basis, you're going to write about it and try to change those conditions. It's just, it's part of your makeup as a human. And certainly part of the work that they were doing. And beyond that, what you said about it not just being Baltimore, yes, I mean, anywhere in the world where we were seeing racial terror happen, it was going to be documented in the Afro if they knew about it. And beyond that, I should mention that while the Afro was founded in Baltimore, at its height had 13 different editions, including DC, Richmond, Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey. We had foreign bureaus during World War II, had national edition, evening edition, all of these different editions. So it was certainly not just Baltimore news being covered, but really world news from Black perspectives, and specifically from a Black Baltimorean's perspective, which I think is a unique lens on the world. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Yeah. But it is really fascinating to see the difference in coverage when you look at a single event that happened and to see how different newspapers covered it, or whether they covered it or not. Maybe there wasn't any coverage, and why or why not.
Yeah, the omission.
Yeah,
the omission says almost as much as addressing events in some cases. But what I always found really fascinating, especially with some of that racial terror coverage, was, again, humanizing all the individuals involved, going to interview family members of George Armwood in Somerset County, as opposed to just talking to the white politicians and community members that were going to give whatever their biased viewpoints were of the events. And, you know, definitely, again, want to honor not just Clarence Mitchell Jr., but Levi Jolly and others who really advanced that cause through the work that they did as young people with the newspaper.
And I think the through line with all of that is that it's really about a human experience. I mean, you mentioned earlier, it's not just activism that's covered in the newspaper. It really is like birthdays, weddings, people coming to town. It's really about lived human experience and seeing our lives reflected in full and in print. And that to me is why the archives are such a rich record, because you see people grow up in the collection. You know, like you can see somebody who was written about as an 11-year-old singer, and then he's 30 and he's touring the world as an opera singer, and he shows up again, and then he's 80 and he's in a public program. You know, it's like there's a way of really charting people's lives and finding our ancestors in there as well, to be able to do our own genealogy. It's just rich. And it so often when we find ourselves in other collections, it is about a struggle or it is about pain. And in our collection, I think you just get a full range of human experience, which is rare and really important.
And you talked about a couple, or you alluded to a couple of those campaigns and some of ones that still kind of exist up till today that Dion shared with us in the chat, including the Mrs. Santa initiative and the Clean Block campaign as well. And I can pull up a few images on those if you'd like to speak on that a little bit, because like you said, it wasn't just about highlighting oppression or, you know, focusing on civil rights activism, although that was a central piece. You know, it was about covering and promoting what the community was doing in many different lights.
Yeah, I think if we didn't have to talk about those things, that'd be great. But unfortunately, that's the world that we've been in for so long. So that's going to be part of what we have to write about. But yeah, there's just so many beautiful images. So the Clean Block campaign was founded by Frances Louise Murphy I. And it was founded in, I believe, 1934. And she taught at Coppin's Teacher College. She was Carl Murphy's sister. And she taught a bunch of teachers. So she had this incredible network. And during the summer, she wanted to make sure that kids had something to do, but also wanted to clean up our neighborhoods and take pride in our neighborhoods. So she came up with this program, Clean Block. And each block would have a block captain. They would be responsible for making sure that everybody else on the block was doing their work. The teachers who she taught organized their classrooms in order to, you know, get the initial people to enroll. So that's how she reached all of these children everywhere, was through the teachers that she had actually taught, which is pretty ingenious. And then throughout the summer, they would spend time cleaning up their blocks. And at a certain point, there would be a judgment day, and the winning blocks got some sort of prize. So it was like a block party, or everybody went to a movie. So there's all these great photos in the collection of kids celebrating in the streets and having a great time. And so that is a pretty remarkable legacy. And anytime I talk about the Afro with people, I either hear from them like, oh, I was, or my grandfather was, or my dad was a paper boy, or I remember scrubbing steps with Ajax. Thank you. See, it's like, you can't go anywhere in Baltimore and say Clean Block without hearing a really personal story. So it's a program that has touched a lot of different people's lives.
To get back to some of the kind of artistic engagement and work with students that you mentioned earlier on in the conversation, what are some of the projects that you've engaged with that had kind of direct student involvement, whether it was them kind of feeding off the archives for artistic purposes, or, you know, creating some other visual representation?
Yeah. Last year, we launched the first Afro Fellowship program for high school students, and it was really a pilot at Coppin Academy. And we had 15 students who we were working with, and they spent the course of a semester really digging into the collection with a teaching artist, Unique Robinson. We partnered with Leaders of Tomorrow Youth Center on that program, and they learned how to do archival research using the Enoch Pratt Library. They visited the collection at the Maryland State Archives, and they developed their own research projects. And ultimately, they made a short documentary about relationships and love that they debuted at their showcase at the UB Blake Center last year. Or yeah, I'm like, or was that earlier this year? It was earlier this year. I don't know what's happening with time. So yeah, this is an image from that final day of their program. And the reason why they landed on relationships and love is because they found that in the Afro archives too, and they were interested in there. There used to be a dating column called the Lonely Hearts Club, and people would write in and say, you know, I mean, it was a personal classifieds thing where they write in and say what they're looking for and who they wanted to find. And then hopefully somebody would write back to them. So they kind of took some of those themes and wove it into a short documentary that they made. And this year we're partnering with Muse 360, which is based here in Baltimore, founded by Sharena Christmas. And she has been running a program called New Generation Scholars since 2007. And similarly, the students are looking into the archives and creating new work inspired by what they found there. And actually this Saturday from 3 to 5 at Nomu Nomu, which is on North Howard Street, they're going to be sharing some of what they've been working on so far. They've been creating their own personal archives and connecting their stories to wider themes throughout the African diaspora. So we'll see what they've come up with. And that'll be from 3 to 5 this weekend. So that'll be the first little taste of this year's cohort of young people working with the archives. So we're just getting started. There's so much to do, you know, but we're a very small team, and we are, partnering with people where we can, so we can kind of build capacity and plug in and make sure that people have access to this collection, because that's what it's here for.
And the more that folks from the public donate and support the Afro Charities and the archives, the more that, you know, we're able to increase that access, and also that, you know, incredible work with young people as well as other members of the public. So I can't get through this conversation without mentioning how indebted we are here at the Maryland Center for the contributions, not just of Paul Henderson, but of the Afro Charities and the archives to some of our exhibition work. We have one of our newest exhibitions is called Passion and Purpose, Voices of Civil Rights Activism in Maryland. And it's really essential to lean into the visuals of the movement as well as the everyday life of individuals in the 20th century. And, you know, some of those stories really hit home for me, you know, whether that is looking at the integration of Baltimore Polytechnic Institute in 1952, which is pre-Brown versus Board, which again covered in both or more local newspapers, but you were actually hearing from the students in a very unique way through the Afro newspaper, those 9 or 10 initial students who entered the school in 1952. So humanizing, bringing those voices into the public sphere and really advancing, telling those stories. But that whole exhibition, you know, couldn't have happened without those images and without those, you know, perspectives from the newspaper articles. So I want to thank you personally, as well as everybody that made that happen. I assume there must be, but are there other kind of either local or national museums outside of Maryland, or maybe even publications that come to mind for you that really use the archives in a creative or interesting way?
There's so many. I feel like Dion could probably put all of them in the chat because she's been handling most of those research requests. But the first that comes to mind is the National Museum of African American History and Culture has one of the printing presses from the Afro there on display, as well as an image of Mamie Till that came from our collection as well. There was recently an exhibition about Alma Thomas, who's a really well-known now Black woman painter, abstract painter, but in the catalog, they pulled an image from our collection of her at a very early time in her life when she was making puppets. And who knew that she even had that as a background, except that it was in an article in the Afro, and then they pulled that image from us. So that was part of their catalog, which I thought was great. There's so many, I don't know. I mean, like, we could go on forever, but two projects that we helped to steward using the archives creatively. In 2020, we did an exhibition called Close Read, which was actually at the former Afro building on North Charles Street. And it was a projection of 3 different artistic interventions into the archives with Shan Wallace, Akia Breon Brown, and myself. So that was the first time that we had really like invited artists to spend time with the collection and make new work inspired by it. And Shan made a few kind of animated collage videos, and Akia took a pamphlet that was part of the collection and all about urban renewal, and redacted some of the words in it to kind of reveal an underlying message of displacement that was part of that pamphlet. And for my project, it was a first iteration of a video about Martha Murphy and her initial investment into the Afro newspaper and where that money came from and that backstory. And then more recently, we worked with a New York-based artist named Zyveria Simmons, who spent a lot of time remotely because of the pandemic, looking at images, and created an entire new body of work inspired by the collection. And that was in partnership with a French organization called Caddis. And the exhibition debuted in Paris, and then it got picked up and went to Stockholm. And we're working on bringing it back to Baltimore because it's really important that people get to see that work here as well. So we got to find a good venue for it, but that'll be forthcoming. We recently just got a fairly large grant from a new foundation called the Ruth Foundation for the Arts. And it's essentially to grow that artist commissioning program. And so we'll be looking to bring in another wave of Baltimore-based artists to do a similar intervention in the archives, to spend time with the collection and make new works. So that's what we've been up to in terms of creative work. If I wanted to just say, if anybody has any questions, put them in the Q&A, because otherwise we're just going to keep talking forever, and that's okay. But I figured you might have some questions that you would want to have answered. And I was thinking it might be kind of interesting to show like some behind the scenes of what's happening with the digitization.
Sure. Is that so? I can pull that up.
Yeah. Yeah, either of us could do it, I guess. Maybe do the digitization one, and then, so Dion was in the collection recently. Oh, this is a rendering for the Upton Mansion. Dion was in the collection recently and did a great little stop motion video about showing the work that we were doing in there. Megan's in it too. Hi, Megan. Oh, we'll see if it plays. That's the other thing.
Watch Afro Charities digitize and catalog 300 items from the Baltimore Afro American Newspapers Archives in under 1 minute.
In the morning, I wake up to fight for my yard. Yeah, my mind is a warning.
Shout out to the Maryland State Archives.
I've been wandering all day, trying to be fine, but I can't be.
These items come from the Raymond and Sadie Alexander folders. They were both lawyers and civil rights activists in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Be on the lookout for more videos of our digitization efforts. Peace.
So it's a sneak peek of an Instagram post to come. But basically, we've been at Maryland State Archives, and they've been such gracious hosts. They have this really wonderful digital transitions set up there, where it's essentially like a gigantic copy stand machine. So if anybody remembers that. So we've been using that to digitize some of the photographs. And then Megan has developed this system using Airtable that as like a staging area right now for capturing metadata. We're using artificial intelligence to kind of assess what's in the images. So we're getting some really interesting keywords pulled out that we don't have to manually input, which is really amazing. But we just need to like do the quality control and check back up on that. So this is what we've been doing kind of all year long, is getting this workflow established, and we're finally at a point where it's actually working. So that's really exciting. And so, you know, it was 300 items in a minute because it was sped up, but it was 300 items in a day, which is pretty awesome. So that's what we're up to.
Absolutely. And, just so I don't forget that I need to circle back with you on Alma Thomas and this puppet making, because we are going to be hosting the Jim Henson exhibition here starting in May of next year. So any sort of stories like that can, build out how that artistry developed even before his time would be pretty incredible. So we'll put a pin in that part of the conversation. But we do have at least one question that's come through here in the Q&A for you, and I think this is probably going to be addressed to you, Savannah. Are there broader opportunities for the public to aid in the processing and digitization of the archives?
That is a great question, and we're working on it. So like I was saying just now, we've been spending a large portion of time this year really refining the workflows for all this. What we want to do is have a really foolproof system in place before we invite members of the public to help us with this, because it's complicated and it's intricate. And we want to make sure that it's as uncomplicated as possible when we explain it to somebody else, so that they can just jump in and get into the work. So the short answer is yes, in the future. And the longer answer is we're still working out the kinks to figure out exactly how we can do that. But that is definitely an aim to involve community members in the processing and the digitization of this collection. We've done a fair amount so far, but the collection is gigantic. So there's a lot of work still to be done and a lot of opportunities for people to engage with that. Are there any other questions? We only had that one in the Q&A.
Yeah, it looks like that's it so far. I mean, I, of course, will always have more questions for you. So kind of to keep it going, I know as probably Dion dropped it in the chat earlier, and you mentioned the Mrs. Santa initiative, and that's probably coming up here as we get into the season. So what should folks be on the lookout for there?
Yeah, so Mrs. Santa has been going on for more than 60 years. So it's a long-standing tradition in Baltimore. And it really started with the Afro American newspaper. So it actually predates the existence of Afro Charities. But we've been working with the Afro for all this time to make it happen. So basically, there's organizations throughout Baltimore, there's individuals who donate money, donate bikes. There's a fraternal group that donates bikes every year. They donate gifts, toys, that kind of thing. And then there is a gift giveaway. We also invite families that are in need to send letters to the Afro, to Mrs. Santa, describing, what ages their children are, what types of toys might make their holiday a little bit brighter. And then we try to match those people up with some of the resources that have been donated. So this year on the 17th of December at Nomu Nomu on North Charles Street, we're going to have an actual gift giveaway event, which should be really fun. There will be music. There's going to be some light refreshments. There will be some gingerbread house making and a toy giveaway. So if you know people who might be in need this year, you can send them our way. We'll be there. And if you know people who might want to donate, you can either go to our website, afrocharities.org/donate, or write to us, info@afrocharities.org, if you have physical things that you'd like to donate. You could just bring those on the day of as well. But it should be fun. It's
Awesome.
going to be a good time.
Well, a lot of exciting things on the horizon, whether, immediately this year with some of that public engagement, or, long term on some of those projects that you mentioned. But of course, support is needed to keep all of that moving. And as we start to wrap up here, again, I want to give thanks to not only you, Savannah, for taking the time, but also your colleagues who are so active and supportive in the chat, and letting us know where we can find all of this incredible information. And again, as a researcher and educator, who knows where I would be if I didn't have the access that was already available and made it really a full picture for me as I'm engaging in this work. So thank you to everybody who made that possible. So at this point, we'll start to wrap up here. And if there are any other additional questions, you can throw them in the chat while we're here.
I have one more thing to
Yeah.
say. You know, we talk a lot about the Afro in the past tense because we've been preserving the archives that relate to the past. But the Afro is a publication that is still publishing to this day and is actually helmed by Francis Tony Draper, who is a 4th generation descendant of the founders and is still doing quality journalism today. So you can go to afro.com if you want to subscribe there. There's a physical publication that gets sent to your house directly weekly. It's also plenty of content online and so many other things. So take a look at that as well.
Absolutely. We never want to lose sight of, you know, a lot of these historical archives and entities that are still living to this day, right? Let's continue to support that in kind of both ways. But with that, it was a wonderful chat. Always appreciate your time, and looks like Chloe is back with us. Do you have any parting words?
I could not add any more to this conversation. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you both so much for such a fruitful discussion. Thank you, Dion, for pretty much being my other half, sharing resources. I'm very excited to share everything with attendees and registrants afterwards. But thank you, everybody who came on and joined us during this lunch hour today. Please, I will keep the program open for one more minute. There's a lot of really great things in the chat. I want to give people a chance to grab all of that information and let Dion continue plugging all the wonderful links and resources. But for now, thank you again. Thank you so much, Savannah. Thank you, David, for being a wonderful host. Thank you both for all your resources. And also want to remind our audience, this program will be available via our virtual program archive that will also be shared in the follow-up email within the next few weeks. Otherwise, everybody—
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Everybody have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you all around next year. In the meantime, happy holidays. Sign up for that Mrs. Santa program. It sounds wonderful. And see you all again at some point.
Take care.